What if the person you slept beside for 40 years was never real at all? I am 82 years old, and I am saying this out loud for the first time because there is no more time left to protect a lie that was never mine to begin with. For most of my life, I believed I had a quiet marriage, an ordinary husband, a predictable past. That illusion collapsed the day he died, but the truth had been breathing beside me long before that. I met my husband in the late 1950s. He was polite, distant, in a way that felt old-fashioned, careful with words, careful with people. Back then, men like that were called serious, responsible, safe. He never spoke much about his childhood. He said he moved often. He said his family was gone. I didn't push. Women didn't push in those days. Silence was considered maturity. But looking back now, with the weight of decades pressing on my chest, I see the patterns I refused to name. No childhood friends. No photographs before his 30s. No hometown we could visit. Every question had an answer that sounded reasonable, yet never complete. I learned to accept half-truths as intimacy. I mistook emotional distance for strength. We lived through historical moments together. Assassinations on the radio, wars on television. Names like JFK, Hoover, organized crime whispered in documentaries decades later. He always changed the channel, always left the room when certain stories came on. I thought it was anxiety. I thought it was trauma. I never imagined it was fear. There were moments, small but sharp, that should have stopped me cold. Men he didn't introduce. Mail that vanished before I could read it. Sudden moves explained by vague job changes. I told myself love required trust, and trust meant not asking questions that could break what felt stable. Now I understand something terrifying. The man I loved was not hiding from me. He was hiding with me. Our marriage was not just a relationship. It was a shield, a carefully constructed normal life, designed to erase another identity completely. The night he died, I believed I was about to mourn a husband. Instead, I began uncovering a stranger, and what I found next was not meant for wives, not meant for families, and certainly not meant to surface this late in history. If you are still listening to this, then you already feel it, the weight of a truth that stayed buried for decades. Stories like this are not just about secret. They are about how history hides inside ordinary lives, how entire identities can vanish without a trace, and how love can exist alongside lies powerful enough to reshape reality. Understanding stories like mine matters because these things did not happen in movies. They happened in real homes, real marriages, real families who were never told the full truth. I want you to tell me what you would have done. Would you have asked more questions, or would you have protected the silence the way I did? Leave a comment below and tell me what word comes to mind. Right now, trust, betrayal, or fear. Your perspective matters more than you think. If this story is making you question how much of the past is still hidden, support this channel by leaving a like and subscribing. These confessions exist because people are finally ready to listen, and because some truths only surfaced when it is almost too late. I used to believe that a long marriage naturally smooths over unanswered questions. You stop asking because routine replaces curiosity, and love convinces you that stability is proof enough. But when I began retracing our life after his death, I realized how many warning signs I had quietly folded into normalcy. They were never loud. They were subtle, almost polite, like everything else about him. There were documents he never let me organize. A locked metal box, he claimed, held old tax papers from before we met. Whenever I reached for it, he would gently redirect my attention, smiling, never raising his voice. Back then, privacy was considered a virtue. A man's papers were his own. I told myself that respecting boundaries was the same as respecting him. His stories about the past shifted slightly over the years, not enough to feel like lies, but enough to never fully settle. One year he said he grew up near the coast. Another time it was farmland. The names of schools changed. The years didn't quite align. When I asked, he laughed it off, saying memory fades with time. I believed him because I wanted to, because questioning too hard might reveal something neither of us was prepared to face. There were also the silences, long pauses when certain topics came up. Organized crime trials on the evening news, testimonies, informants, government hearings. His jaw would tighten, he would stand up, walk outside, light a cigarette with shaking hands. He never explained why those moments unsettled him so deeply. I assumed it was guilt from a past mistake, maybe something small. I never imagined it was survival. Instinct. We moved more than other couples, always justifiable reasons. Better work, fresh starts, new opportunities. Looking back, the timing was uncanny. Right after major arrests, right after televised investigations, right after names connected to federal cases surfaced publicly. At the time, it felt like coincidence. Now, it feels like choreography. I even remember a moment in the 1970s when a stranger approached him at a grocery store, spoke a single sentence, and walked away. My husband went pale. That night, he barely slept. The next month, we relocated again. I never asked who that man was. I never demanded answers. Silence felt safer than the truth. Only now do I see it clearly. These were not random behaviors. They were rehearsed, conditioned, designed to keep an old life buried so deeply that even the person closest to him would never dig too far. And yet, one overlooked detail after his death would tear that entire illusion apart. The day my husband died was quiet, almost disappointingly ordinary. No dramatic final words. No confession whispered in a hospital room, just a shallow breath, a long pause, and then silence. I remember thinking that after decades of restraint, even his death felt controlled. I believed the secrets, whatever they were, had died with him. I was wrong. It started with paperwork. Death certificates have a way of demanding honesty from people who spent their lives avoiding it. The nurse asked for his full legal name. I gave it without hesitation. She frowned, typed again, and excused herself. Minutes later, a hospital administrator returned, apologetic but firm, asking me to verify his identity one more time. That was the first crack in the story I had lived inside for 40 years. Within days, the cracks widened. His social security number triggered delays. His fingerprints, taken as routine procedure, were flagged. I was told it was probably a clerical error, something that happens with older records from the 1950s and 60s, but their eyes betrayed them. They knew something wasn't right. And so did I. Then came the call. Not from family, not from a lawyer. From a man who did not introduce himself fully, only stating that he represented a federal department and that my husband's death had activated protocols that could not be ignored. He asked me questions no stranger should know how to ask. Where we met, how long we were married, whether I had ever known him by another name. My hands shook as I answered. That evening, I opened the locked metal box for the first time. Inside were documents I could barely understand, birth certificates with different names, court records partially redacted, letters stamped confidential, dated decades before we met. One photograph stopped my breath completely. A younger version of my husband standing beside men whose faces I later recognized from crime documentaries and congressional hearings. The truth was no longer abstract, it was physical, tangible. Sitting on my dining table, the man I married had not simply lied about his past. He had erased it with help, government help, structured help, protection. I realized then that his death was not the end of the story. It was the trigger. Whatever he had done between 1950 and 1970 was important enough that even now, even after he was gone, the system still remembered him. And it was about to remember me too. They came 3 days after the funeral, just as the last flowers were beginning to wilt. Tu Meng. Dark suits, polite smiles that never reached their eyes. They didn't knock like visitors. They knocked like people who were certain they would be let in. When I opened the door, one of them said my name before I could speak, confirming what I already feared. I was no longer just a widow. I was part of something I had never agreed to join. They sat at my kitchen table, the same place where my husband drank his coffee every morning. One of them referred to him by a name I had never heard before, not a nickname, not an alias that sounded invented. A name that carried weight, spoken carefully, as if even saying it out loud could revive consequences. I corrected him instinctively. He looked at me with something close to pity and said, "That was not the name we knew him by." They explained, slowly, deliberately, as if measuring how much truth an 82-year-old woman could survive. My husband had entered a federal witness protection program decades before we met. Late 1950s, early 1960s, the years blurred together as they spoke about organized crime investigations, federal prosecutions, and testimonies that dismantled entire networks. My husband had not been a criminal, they said. He had been worse. He had been a witness who knew too much. He testified against men who disappeared, men whose names were never printed fully in newspapers, men whose power extended far beyond courtrooms. In exchange, he was erased. New identity, new documents, new life, strict rules, no contact with the past, no explanations to spouses. Love was allowed. Truth was not. I asked the question that had been building inside me since the hospital. Why didn't I know? One of them answered without hesitation, because if I knew, I could be used, threatened, followed, broken. My ignorance was not an accident. It was protection. Then they said something that still keeps me awake at night. They told me my husband had refused several chances to disappear again over the years. He chose to stay with me. That choice, they said, increased his risk, increased mine. The marriage that felt ordinary had been an act of quiet defiance against a system built on fear. Before they left, they warned me gently but clearly. Some truths are safer buried, some names should never be spoken again, and some pasts do not stay quiet once acknowledged. As the door closed behind them, I realized the story I thought I was uncovering was only the surface. The real danger lived in what happened long before I ever met him. Once those men left my house, silence no longer felt safe. It felt staged. I began piecing together the years they carefully avoided detailing. The decades between 1950 and 1970, when my husband was not yet my husband, when the world was darker, messier, and ruled by shadows most people never saw. What I learned didn't come from a single document or confession. It came from fragments, patterns, and the kind of knowledge that settles in your bones once you recognize it. During those years, America was obsessed with power and secrecy. Organized crime didn't just operate in back rooms. It influenced unions, ports, transportation, even politics. Men disappeared without headlines. Witnesses vanished even faster. My husband had been young, ambitious, and placed in the wrong position at the wrong time. He worked close to people who thought they were untouchable. He heard things that were never meant to leave closed rooms. The documents in that metal box referenced grand jury proceedings, sealed testimonies, and federal operations whose names were still partially blacked out. Dates aligned with historic crackdowns I later recognized from documentaries. I understood then why his fear had never faded. Witness protection wasn't a chapter that ended. It was a condition that never expired. What broke me most was realizing the price he paid. He lost his family, his original name, his right to tell his own story. Every friendship we made was filtered. Every photograph, carefully controlled. Even his love for me existed under rules written by people who would never know what it felt like to wake up every day pretending to be someone else. And yet, he stayed. He aged. He built a life that looked real because it was real, even if the foundation was forged in lies. The distorted truth is this: he didn't survive because of witness protection alone. He survived because he accepted a lifetime of silence as the cost of staying alive. But silence leaves residue, leaks into marriages, It reshapes identity, and it leaves people like me holding truths we were never meant to carry this late in life. The deeper I looked, the more I realized this secret wasn't just about crime or protection. It was about what happens when survival demands the erasure of the self. 4 weeks after learning the truth, I kept asking myself the same question in different forms. Was our marriage real if his name was not? Was love still love if it was constructed around a carefully maintained illusion? The answer did not come easily, because it forced me to confront something far more painful than betrayal. It forced me to accept that he loved me honestly while living dishonestly, and that both things could exist at the same time. When I replay our life together, the memories do not feel fake. The arguments were real. The laughter was real. The quiet nights, the shared fears about aging, the way he held my hand when the world felt too loud, all of it happened. The falsehood was not in how he treated me. It was in the frame surrounding our life, an invisible structure designed to keep us both alive. I began to understand that I was not deceived in the way people imagine deception. He did not manipulate me for gain. He did not use me as cover knowingly. He was instructed, conditioned, and warned that revealing the truth would endanger us both. Love, in his case, meant protecting me by keeping me uninformed. The distortion was moral, not emotional. Guilt has a way of surfacing when there is no one left to argue with. I wondered how many times he almost told me, how many nights he lay awake listening to my breathing, rehearsing a confession he could never make. Sometimes I remember him starting sentences and stopping halfway, choosing silence instead. At the time, I thought it was age. Now I know it was restraint. There is a particular cruelty in living a good life built on bad necessities. He was kind because he needed to be invisible. Ordinary because ordinary people are not hunted. Loving because love anchored him to a reality that felt human. And I became part of that camouflage without consent, without awareness, without preparation. What unsettles me most is realizing that if he had survived longer, I might have died never knowing any of this. Our marriage would have ended as it began, quietly, with no record of the truth beneath it. Love survived, but clarity did not. And that raises a final, terrifying question. If life can be real without being true, what else in history rests on the same kind of fragile compromise? There is a reason this story waited until I was 82 years old to exist. Not because the danger disappeared, but because time softened the consequences just enough for truth to breathe. When my husband was alive, revealing his past would not have corrected anything. It would have undone lives, reopened cases meant to stay sealed, and possibly placed both of us in quiet but very real danger. Silence was not cowardice. It was survival stretched across decades. The men who visited me made that clear without saying it directly. Witness protection does not end with death. It ends when memory fades, when names lose relevance, when the people who could retaliate are gone or powerless. Some of the men my husband testified against were buried long ago. Others vanished into history without headlines. Only now, when records are classified, sealed, or forgotten, does this truth become survivable. What hurts most is knowing that timing robbed me of choice. If I had known earlier, I might have lived differently, asked different questions, protected myself emotionally, but knowledge comes with responsibility, and responsibility would have forced me into a role I was never meant to play. I was allowed to be a wife because I was denied the truth. That trade-off shaped my entire life without my consent. There is also guilt I cannot escape. By speaking now, I am breaking a promise I never knew I made. I am disturbing a past designed to remain untouched. But silence has its own cruelty. It traps stories inside people who age with unanswered questions, unresolved grief, and invisible burdens. Truth delayed becomes heavier, not lighter. I share this now because history is not just made by famous names or public trials. It is shaped quietly by ordinary people who absorb consequences meant for others, painfully like me. People like my husband, and when those people disappear, their truths vanish with them, unless someone is brave enough to speak when nothing can be fixed anymore. If you are still here, then you didn't just watch a story. You carried it. Stories like this survive only because people are willing to listen all the way through, even when the truth is uncomfortable, heavy, and impossible to undo. If this confession made you question how many lives are built on secrets that never surface, support this channel by subscribing now. These are not just stories for entertainment. They are reminders of how history hides inside ordinary people. Leave a like if you stayed until the very end, because that tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling matters. And I want you to comment one specific phrase below so I know you truly listened. The truth waited too long. If this story stayed with you, don't stop here. The next video appearing on your screen uncovers another final confession that was never meant to be heard. Watch it now while the truth is still waiting.